welcome back to Mining Network. So I'm joined with Alexandra Scanlon, who is CEO of Barton Gold. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start by getting a nice overview of the company.
So at a very high level, Barton Gold is essentially a pure play South Australian gold focused company, which sort of makes us unique on the ASX. We have consolidated the significant majority of historical producing and major exploration ground in the central Gawler Craton of South Australia. So very renowned geological domain, very well-known historical gold trend, and we've essentially consolidated all the best bits. Within that, we have developed a 1.1 million ounce resource base. We own the only gold mill in the region, and we've been drilling very aggressively, so we are heading towards a resource update, the first that we have done since listing in June 2021 as a public company.
Wow, we'll touch on a lot of those things in a moment there. It sounds very exciting. But let's just start by, could you run us through your market cap, share structure, and how much cash you have in the bank?
Yeah, so we're about a $30 million market cap. We have $10.3 million in cash as at the 30th of September, so about a $20 million Australian enterprise value. In terms of our capital structure, we're a pretty tightly held company. We have a very high degree of management and board alignment. Management and board own about 1/3 of the company, about 175 million shares outstanding as well. So a very sort of tight structure. Both our board and our team reflect a broad suite of skills, both in exploration, financing, development, and operations of assets. So the idea was really put together a very strong company that's an attractive growth and valuation proposition with a real clear plan and the people to deliver that.
Yeah, definitely. So just touching back on what you said about having the only mill in the area, could you give us a bit more detail on that and what the refurb cost would be and the time frame to actually get that producing? Because I mean, that really does set you apart.
Yeah, so we acquired that mill in 2019, and that was actually for us sort of a strategic anchor in the area, being the only mill. It is a region where other explorers have come in and around us now, so there's an attractive opportunity to look at things like toll milling. But that mill was producing gold from one of our open pits in 2017 and 2018. So it was operating as lately as September 2018. Mm-hmm. When it was shut down, it was sort of properly shut down and put on care and maintenance. So the ball mills were lifted off the bearings. It's a very low-cost care and maintenance regime. And in terms of restarting that mill, what we're looking at is essentially a mill recommissioning. It's not a reconstruction. There are opportunities to optimize that mill if we want. But we haven't put together a formal study around this, but rough estimate, we believe we can just recommission the mill for less than $5 million Australian. So very, very short drawbridge to cross for us to just elect to go into operations.
Yeah, and the time frame for that, would it be pretty quick?
If we decided to recommission the mill, it would be very quick to do, yeah. So the mill itself is on a fully permitted mining lease, and we have our EPA licenses in place. We have all of our mining approvals in place. So it's really a question for us of when we want to actually push that button. And there are some excellent mill specialists who specialize in workovers and refurbishments. We've seen some really high-speed ones lately in Australia, 6 and 7 week workovers. But I think we'd give ourselves a few months to recommission the mill. It's really about making sure we're comfortable what's going in the front end of the mill, because the mill itself is quite simple and it does its job very well.
No, that's brilliant. You're in control there by the sounds of it. And so that's obviously excellent infrastructure that you have in place. Do you have is the infrastructure all over pretty good? That was a bit, let me reword that. So you have the mill in place. Is there other infrastructure in the area that's I'm trying to just get a general overview of the infrastructure, so So you have the mill in place. Is the general infrastructure of the region pretty good?
Yeah, so we have the mill, and next to that mill, we actually have a full mining camp and village and all sorts of ancillary services. We actually have a 2-kilometer airstrip next to that camp and mill. That camp is a 260-person camp. We've actually been disposing of some of that because it's highly surplus to our needs. When you look down to our other projects, we also have accommodation for about 40 people in the town of Tarkula, near our Tarkula project. And then we also have an exploration camp next to Tunkilia. So we've got sort of infrastructure distributed. And then regionally, when you look at this area, we're actually at the heart of Australian infrastructure. So we have the east to west sort of transnational rail line, sort of Sydney, Adelaide to Perth. and also the spur line that goes up to Darwin, and these pass right through our projects. To the east of us, about 80 or 100 kilometers, we have the Stewart Highway, which goes from Adelaide all the way up into Coober Pedy and Woomera. So we're very well connected. In fact, while we are in the very center of South Australia and very much in the heart of the outback, and it is a 10-hour drive to site, it's about 85% on sealed roads. So very, very well serviced by infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely. And so you did mention about having some significant neighbours around the mill that you've acquired. Could you talk me through those neighbours and a little bit about how the geology differs or is similar?
Yeah, so as we look at our three different projects, and so this is the sort of historical Challenger project, Tarkula and Tunkillia, the geology is actually very different between these different project areas. Around our various projects, we've had a number of junior explorers, some of whom have been there previously and others who've come into play more recently since we announced that we were sort of coming into the region with a dedicated large-scale focus. One of our joint venture partner on that ground in the vicinity of the mill, Central Gawler Mill, is a company called Marmota Limited. They have one of their projects called Aurora Tank, which is about 50 kilometers east of our mill. But importantly, we also have joint venture gold resources with them. We own about 20% of the ground. They own about 80% of the ground. Therefore, they are majority funding it. But there's about 320,000 ounces of gold on that JV ground within about 40 kilometers of the mill. So it does present another interesting opportunity to look at either subsidizing some stage one operations or just toll milling in the region.
Definitely. So talk me through, some of your assets are monetized now, is that correct?
Correct.
So you actually have some cash flow coming in from certain assets. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so during the financial year 2022, so that year ended 30th of June, we had about $2.4 million of income, the majority of which came from both gold sales and asset sales during June. We actually did a clean out of our mill and we removed about $1.7 million worth of gold from the mill. So we sold $1 million of that gold during June to ABC Bullion. We also sold the minority portion of our camp near the Central Gawler Mill. And the reason is that camp is originally for about 260 people. For what we see our strategy evolving as in the region, a good portion of that camp is surplus. It's actually a fairly old camp. Mostly dating back to the late 2000s or early 2010s. And in Australia right now, there's actually quite a shortage of available camp accommodation because of supply chain constraints coming from China. So the opportunity is actually to sell this camp, which is 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, for a price that's higher than it was worth new at that time. And this, for us, is obviously infrastructure we don't need, never will. And it's obviously a fantastic source of income for us to subsidize our treasury and ongoing exploration.
Yeah, definitely. And so alongside those monetized assets, you also are doing a lot of just general exploration work on your properties. Could you talk me through the current exploration program? Are you drilling? Is it boots on the ground? What sort of things are you up to?
We are very actively drilling at the moment. So we have discovered 4 new gold zones since we IPO'd about 16 months ago. 3 of those are in the vicinity of the Tunkillia project, so this has rapidly expanded the footprint of that project, and we are expecting to do a similar thing with the Tarkula project early next year, because we've mapped out a series of repeating shears and structures. But what we're looking at in terms of resource growth in the first instance is Tunkillia. We have an existing 965,000 ounce resource there. We upgraded that resource in October 2020 before we went public. When we acquired it, it was a 558,000 ounce resource. And that resource is about 2.5 kilometers long. It's open to strike and depth extensions. And importantly, the vast majority of the drilling that informed that resource was done when the US dollar gold price was between about $300 and $800 US per ounce. So in a sense, there was a very artificially restricted search domain historically. We think that, therefore, has got considerable room to grow on that existing 965,000 ounce resource. The 3 new gold zones that we've discovered as sort of satellites, if you will, to that resource are exciting because they demonstrate fairly conclusively that the geological endowment, or the gold endowment of this shear zone, is much, much greater than was historically recognized. And our latest discovery is an area called Area 51. Silly name, but it is a full 3.5 kilometers away from that existing deposit. So it's a very conclusive step out in terms of the scale of this orogenic style of mineralization. So what we are doing now, having discovered all these zones, we actually currently have a 12,000 meter drilling program underway. We announced a 9,000 meter program early in September. We expanded that, obviously, because we like what we're seeing. And the objective is to inform a resource update during March 2023.
That's brilliant. No, I look forward to seeing what that MRE is next year. So in terms of the history of the sites, at Tarkula, it's open pit and it was acquired in that state, is that correct? And there's scope to expand that from all directions, is that?
Yeah, so Tarkula is interesting because this was actually the site of the historical South Australian gold rush. It was actually the Tarkula gold rush in 1893. So this happened around the same time as the Western Australian gold rush around Kalgoorlie. And there was an open pit that was mined during 2018 over the site of this historical high-grade mining. And so in the first half of the 1900s, this is when you had the old-timers, if you will, with picks and shovels and doing things the very hard way. They were mining gold at over 1 ounce per ton from surface, from just high-grade structures sticking out of the ground. In 2017 and 2018, a small open pit was developed, targeting some of that high-grade mineralization. And from this pit, it was only actually a very shallow pit. So it was about 30 meters deep in the north and about 70 meters deep in the south, about 500 meters long. This pit produced about 50,000 ounces of gold. The historical operators of that pit, though, did not reinvest in depth or strike extensions. So we've drilled both beneath that pit in something we call the deliverance target, the deliverance structure below the pit. And we also drilled a long strike, and we've delineated about 200 meter depth extension of mineralization below this pit. Probably more interesting, we found an entirely new high-grade gold zone immediately adjacent to the pit, so as an extension of the southern end of the pit. So it presents some real opportunities to just look at that as early mineralization. The more exciting thing, though, is the sort of modern geophysics and technology that we've brought into this long overlooked region indicates that we may have multiple repeats of that style of high-grade open pitable mineralization right on the mining lease itself. So potentially we could have 2, 3, 4 of these open pits on a fully permitted mining lease. But as we look across the project area, just 10 kilometers to the west, we have mapped out a series of repeating shears and structures that were previously not recognized, but above which some historical explorers had done a little bit of wildcat drilling and had some really interesting exploration results without any context. So we now have that context, and we'll be following that up with more geophysical work and hopefully start to map out how we might have multiple clusters of high-grade open pits.
Wow, that's really exciting to hear. So in your eyes, where do you see Barton Gold going in the next 5 years? What's your vision for it?
So we have now come out and stated a 5-year vision, and that is to be producing 150,000 ounces per annum. So that would do a couple things for us. That is the big picture development concept around Tarkula and Tunkilia as a joint rationalized development package. They're 70 kilometers apart, so the more interesting that one becomes, so too does the other, because they play off of one another. 150,000 ounces would also make us the largest gold producer in South Australia. So we actually think that's a fairly achievable, measurable objective. We obviously have a lot of growth and planning to do on the path there. But as we grow these resources, we think that they will continue to extend and grow and give us the confidence to actually start development studies a little bit earlier than one might, targeting this scale of production. And once we are sort of mapping out this objective and the pathway to get to this objective, because we have our existing mill, because that mill has processed ore from Tarkula, we do have the opportunity to just bring forward stage 1 operations. So we can bring forward production 2 or 3 years. And if, for example, we were sending 3 gram per ton ore from high-grade pits at Tarkula to our mill, at its current capacity, if we don't expand the capacity, that would be producing about 60,000 ounces per annum. So not an altogether enormous amount of production, but a strong start that would generate a lot of free cash, and of course change us from being an explorer developer to an operator. And then when we go to build our second mill at Tunkilia, of course we have a very different financing profile, both as to equity as well as more conventional bank finance.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's brilliant to hear. So just to conclude in a nice manner, as a company, what are you most proud of achieving over the past 12 months?
I would have to say it is the geological proof of concept. It's an area that people have, I think, maybe long assumed that there's nothing interesting because nobody ever demonstrated anything interesting. Before we IPO'd, we spent $8 to $10 million doing geophysical and drilling work. We put together a geological thesis that we thought supported a much larger scale exploration strategy. And since IPO, essentially we have 4 targeted and validated 4 new gold zones. So that's an unusually high hit rate, if you will. And we think that really just sort of sets the table for some pretty exciting times to come.
Definitely. And talking about times to come, what key milestones can investors be looking out for in the next 12 months?
So next 12 months, certainly a resource update in March 2023. We would expect to be releasing our exploration results from this current drilling program. So kind of the end of November, December, January, February, about 12,000 meters of drilling results. That should then essentially culminate in a resource update in March 2023. And then in reality, based upon that, we're also going to go back out and keep growing. We're very well capitalized. We see a lot of potential in these assets. We'll be doing this both at Tarkula as well as Tarkula. And the hope will be then that will continue to give us growth momentum in these assets, both in terms of footprint and resources, and allow us to essentially kick off feasibility studies toward the end of 2023 or the beginning part of 2024.
Well, exciting things to come. I look forward to following along with it. Thank you so much for your time today, Alexander.
Thank you for having us.